Out of the top 10 deadliest snipers of World War II, 9 were Soviet. The 10th? A lone Finn. Not a single German made the list. When you look at the numbers, Soviet snipers like Mikhail Surkov racked up 702 confirmed kills, while the deadliest German sniper, Matthias Hetzenauer, barely crossed 345. That's more than double. But the real story isn't just about individual shooters. It's about a system specifically designed to mass-produce killers in the most brutal urban warfare the world had ever seen. And now you're going to see exactly how they did it. When most people think about World War II snipers, they picture lone wolves stalking through forests or perched in church towers. The reality on the Eastern Front was completely different. By the time German forces pushed into Stalingrad in August 1942, they walked into a meat grinder that favored one very specific type of warfare: close quarters, rubble-strewn urban combat, where a man with a rifle and patience could rack up kills faster than an entire infantry platoon. Stalingrad wasn't just another city. It stretched for nearly 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, a sprawling industrial center turned into a moonscape of collapsed buildings, twisted metal, and mountains of debris. The German Sixth Army, accustomed to rapid advances across open steppe, suddenly found themselves fighting building to building, room to room, sometimes just across a single wall from their enemy. Traditional infantry tactics broke down completely. Artillery and air support became almost useless when the front line ran through the middle of a factory floor. This was the perfect environment for snipers, and the Soviets knew it. But here's what most people miss. The Soviets didn't just get lucky with the terrain. They had been preparing for this type of warfare since the 1930s. While other armies treated snipers as specialized oddities, rare specialists tucked away in elite units, the Soviet military integrated sniping into their core infantry doctrine. They established dedicated sniper schools, created standardized training programs, and most importantly, they built an industrial pipeline for producing shooters at scale. The numbers tell the story. During the war, over 428,000 Soviet soldiers received sniper training. That's not a typo. Nearly 500,000. Of those, around 9,500 achieved higher-level qualifications. By comparison, the Germans trained a fraction of that number, and the Americans even fewer. The Soviet approach was simple: identify anyone with decent marksmanship skills, put them through a rapid training program, and deploy them to the front as quickly as possible. Quality would come from experience, those who survived. At Stalingrad, the average lifespan of a newly trained Soviet sniper was 2 weeks. That sounds catastrophic until you understand the mathematics behind it. If you deploy 100 snipers and 50 survive past that 2-week mark, those survivors become exponentially more dangerous. They've learned to read the battlefield, to identify enemy patterns, to exploit the environment. They become the mentors for the next wave. This was the Soviet leverette system, named after young hares. Fresh snipers were paired with veterans in groups of 3, 1 experienced shooter and 2 trainees. The veteran taught them everything, from camouflage techniques to wind reading to psychological warfare, all while actively hunting Germans. Vasily Zaitsev became the poster child for this system. Before Stalingrad, he was a clerk in the Pacific Fleet with no combat experience. But he'd grown up hunting deer and wolves in the Ural Mountains, and that foundation of fieldcraft translated perfectly to urban warfare. Within 10 days of arriving at Stalingrad, he'd killed 40 German soldiers with a standard-issue Mosin-Nagant rifle. Not a specialized sniper rifle, just a regular infantry weapon with iron sights. His success caught the attention of Soviet command, and they made him a trainer on the front lines. He'd spend mornings teaching groups of 20 to 30 students, then afternoons actively sniping. His students would watch him work, learning his techniques in real combat conditions. Some of them would be dead within days. Others, like the ones who survived, would go on to rack up their own impressive kill counts. Now, compare that to the German approach. German snipers were trained in Berlin at dedicated schools, then deployed to units as individual specialists. They received excellent training, sometimes months of it, focusing on precision, camouflage, and patience. Their equipment was often superior. They had access to rifles with better optics, rangefinders, and advanced ammunition. In theory, a German sniper should have been more effective than his Soviet counterpart. But theory doesn't account for the mathematics of attrition. Here's the critical difference. When a German sniper was killed, that was it. Months of training and investment gone. The unit lost its specialist. It might be weeks or months before a replacement arrived, if one arrived at all. When a Soviet sniper died, there were two more being trained to replace him, often right there in the rubble of Stalingrad. The system was self-perpetuating. Veterans trained novices, novices became veterans. The cycle continued. Even if the Soviets suffered higher casualties among their snipers, they could absorb those losses and maintain operational effectiveness. The equipment gap wasn't as significant as you might think either. Yes, German rifles like the Karabiner 98K with a Zeiss scope were precision instruments. But at the ranges typical in urban combat, 100 to 300 meters, the standard Mosin Nagant with a PU scope was more than adequate. Soviet snipers weren't trying to make 800-meter shots across open fields. They were firing from bombed-out apartments into the windows of buildings across the street. At those distances, what mattered more was patience, positioning, and understanding human behavior. Soviet snipers developed tactics specifically for urban warfare that the Germans struggled to counter. One was the sixes method: 3 two-man teams, a sniper and a spotter in each pair, working a section of the front. They'd coordinate their fire, creating overlapping kill zones that made it nearly impossible for Germans to move without exposing themselves to at least one shooter. Another tactic was psychological. Snipers would deliberately wound rather than kill certain targets, choosing non-lethal shots that would require multiple soldiers to evacuate the wounded man. One casualty became 3 men out of action, and the screaming served as a constant reminder that nowhere was safe. They also weaponized the environment in ways the Germans couldn't match. Soviet soldiers knew every street, every building, every pile of rubble in their own city. They'd lived there before the battle. German troops were fighting in an alien landscape, constantly disoriented by the maze of destruction. Soviet snipers would spend days setting up a single position, camouflaging themselves into collapsed walls or beneath debris, waiting for the perfect shot. They understood that in this type of warfare, movement meant death. The Germans, trained for mobile warfare, struggled to adapt to the static, grinding nature of urban combat. During the Leningrad siege, the dynamics shifted, but the Soviet advantages remained. The siege lasted 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944. Unlike Stalingrad's close-quarters combat, Leningrad presented longer-range engagements across no-man's lands and frozen landscapes. But the Soviets adapted. They used snipers not just for killing enemy soldiers, but for suppression and area denial. A single well-positioned sniper could shut down an entire section of trench line, preventing Germans from manning positions or moving supplies. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers developed what they called sniper fever, a constant paranoid state where any movement could bring instant death. Soviet female snipers added another dimension. Over 2,400 women served as snipers during the war, and many became some of the deadliest shooters on the front. Lyudmila Pavlichenko alone killed 309 German soldiers, most of them officers and enemy snipers. The Germans found this profoundly unsettling. Soviet propaganda exploited this, publicizing the female snipers' success, which further demoralized German troops. The idea that they were being systematically hunted by women challenged their preconceptions and added to the psychological warfare. There's one more factor that's rarely discussed: motivation. Soviet snipers were fighting for their homeland, often in their own cities and towns. They'd seen what the German invasion brought: mass executions, scorched earth policies, the starvation of civilians. This wasn't abstract warfare to them. Every kill was personal. German snipers, skilled as they were, lacked that visceral connection to the battlefield. They were professionals doing a job. Soviet snipers were survivors fighting for survival. The statistical disparity becomes clear when you look at the top performers. Mikhail Surkov, 702 kills. Ivan Sidorenko, 500 kills. Fyodor Oklopkov, 429 kills. These weren't outliers. They were products of a system that prioritized volume, adaptability, and ruthless efficiency over individual excellence. For every super sniper with hundreds of kills, there were dozens of snipers with 20 or 30, and hundreds more with 5 or 10. The aggregate effect was overwhelming. By the end of the war, Soviet sniping doctrine had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. They'd proven that snipers weren't just specialized assets, but could be integrated at scale into conventional infantry operations. The lessons learned in Stalingrad and Leningrad influenced Soviet military thinking for decades, and many of those tactics are still used by Russian forces today. The German military, despite their technical sophistication and training excellence, never adapted to this mass deployment model. They remained committed to the specialist approach, and in the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, that meant they were always outnumbered, outpositioned, and ultimately outmatched. The 3x kill count advantage wasn't about better equipment or superior marksmanship. It was about system design. The Soviets built a machine for producing and deploying snipers faster than the enemy could eliminate them, all while operating in an environment that maximized their effectiveness and minimized German advantages. When you're fighting in the ruins of your own city, with a rifle that's good enough, training that's adequate, and motivation that's absolute, you don't need to be the best shooter. You just need to be the one who survives long enough to take the shot. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out by subscribing.